Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us, and welcome to this session of Flickering Reality, exploring ideas in film and television. Today, we'll be talking about persona, masks that conceal, masks that reveal. Before we begin, I'd just like to remind everyone of a couple of Zoom rules for this call. First of all, during the presentations, we ask participants to turn off their microphone just to ensure better quality audio. For this reason, we may mute you if you hear any background noise, but this is not to silence anyone. This is just purely for good audio reasons. If a participant would like to ask a question or make a contribution to the discussion later in the session, please use the raise your hand function on Zoom, which can be found in the reactions at the bottom of your screen. Or if you can't find it, physically raise your hand, and if I spot you, you can turn on your microphone. Otherwise, if you feel a bit shy, you can use the chat section of the Zoom call. Feel free to keep using it throughout this session, as it's a great way to share your ideas with other participants on this call. We also invite participants to turn on their video camera, as we believe it creates a nice educational environment if we see everyone's faces and reactions. But if you're not comfortable doing so, feel free to just keep it off. And finally, this session is recorded. It's recorded both for archival reasons for us, but also this will be available on our YouTube channel later this week. So feel free to subscribe to our channel so you can access all previous free events, including this one. Now we can begin with the event. Enough about rules. Today we welcome Dr. Kevin Liu, Senior Lecturer and Director of the MA Jungian and Post-Jungian Studies at the University of Essex. Kevin has published several publications on many topics, including the Jungian perspectives on graphic novels and film adaptations, and various essays on race and culture. Today, Kevin will have his presentation, which should last about an hour, followed by live discussion and Q&A. In this session, Kevin will focus on film and persona. The persona is the Jung's theory on how we present ourselves with masks that conceal our true self, but can also be revealing by heightening some aspects of our true personality, and how these relationships with one persona can be displayed through the medium of film. And now I'll pass it over to you, Kevin. Welcome.
Fantastic, James. Just quickly, I want to thank the Pari Center for inviting me. Really great to go through this as well. So thank you so much, James, for bringing me in, and also to my good friend and colleague, Dr. Chris Hawk, for making the introduction, which I really, really appreciate. Okay. So before we jump into a more explicit discussion of the persona, I'd just like to begin with a bit of a reflective exercise. All right, no need to jot things down, but perhaps it will stir some memories as we go through this. So I'd like all our colleagues here to think back to their teenage years. What style of clothing did you wear as a teenager? What was your style of hair? How did you identify yourself? And if you had posters or pictures in your room, who or what were they of? Okay, so we'll fast forward a bit more. Let's go to our mid-20s. Now, how did you hold yourself in your 20s? What were your dreams and aspirations? Who or what did you want to become? And if you had posters or pictures in your room or flat, apartment, house, who or what were they of? Now we'll move again, let's say to our mid-30s and above. Now, if you have posters and pictures in your room, house, apartment, flat, who or what are they of? Now, hopefully everyone is getting the sense of where I'm going with this. I'm really trying to capture what the predominant persona was in each particular period. Has there been any movement? And what are your aspirations now? And how do these differ from the goals and dreams you had, let's say, as a teenager? Now, my rationale for choosing or emphasizing posters and pictures in particular is because I believe these are snapshots of who you are presenting yourself to be at a particular point in time, what constitutes you. Because it's usually the case, the people we choose to invite into our homes, they're the ones who are going to see these photos and these posters. And by the very fact that we're putting them up on display for everyone to see gives a sense, gives a persona, if you will, right, of what we want others to perceive in us. So without further ado then, let me just start the screen share. Actually, I'll turn the optimization off for now. Okay, and I'm sure colleagues can see that, and we'll start from the beginning. Okay, excellent. Oops, we'll go back one. Okay, so the persona in Jung's psychology is an archetype. Now it's linked to many other archetypes or other ideas in Jung. And in particular, at least at first glance, the persona is linked to the shadow. So you can ask, what is the shadow a shadow of? The shadow is the shadow of the persona. Now, James gave a beautiful introduction there that kind of probably shaved off 10 minutes of the presentation, but never mind. Let's keep going. Simply stated, the persona is the social mask one wears and presents to the outer world. It denotes what one wishes to be in the eyes of others. We can have multiple masks depending on our various social roles. So in my own case, I'm a lecturer, an academic, a husband, a father, a son, a friend, a brother, and an uncle. And for me, I see the persona as intricately connected to this notion of decorum. How do we act in certain social situations? What is correct? What is perhaps the correct way or a more correct way to act when we're in different settings? So I'll give you an example. The way I speak to my mother is very different to the way I would speak to my friends, the friends I've known for my entire life. The way I interact with my students, although I try to be as open and as authentic with them, will have some boundaries as well. And again, that is very different to, let's say, the way I interact with my family members. And would it be conducive to life if I lectured my wife as if she was a student, right? Rather than seeing her as an equal life partner. Now, I can tell you that if I did that, I would not be in front of you here today, right? So there's certainly something about the persona, something really, really crucial. And I just want to go directly to Jung here to start off. And I'll just read the highlighted bits, the important bits, at least what I've distilled as the important bits. So on the persona, Jung writes, this arbitrary segment of the collective psyche, often fashioned with considerable pains, I have called the persona. The word persona is really a very appropriate expression for it, since it originally meant the mask worn by an actor signifying the role he or she played. But, as its name shows, it is only a mask for the collective psyche that feigns individuality and tries to make others and oneself believe that one is individual, whereas one is simply playing a part in which the collective psyche speaks. Okay, end quote. So the persona is also the mechanism by which the ego relates to the external world. And I want all colleagues here to keep this in mind as we will be returning to this point. So it is that part of the total personality that is concerned with collective adaptation, and for me at least, by extension, concerned with relationship. So I want to move on to another quotation on the persona. From Jung, fundamentally, the persona is nothing real. It is a compromise between individual and society as to what a man or woman should appear to be. He or she takes a name, earns a title, represents an office. He or she is this or that. In a certain sense, all this is real, yet in relation to the essential individuality of the person concerned, it is only a secondary reality, a product of compromise, in making which others often have a greater share than he or she. The persona is a semblance, a two-dimensional reality to give us a nickname, end quote. Now, based on these two quotations that I've presented here, one might begin to ask, well, why is the persona an archetype? Why did Jung classify the persona as an archetype? There seems to be an inherent contradiction. From what we describe here, it seems the persona is largely dealing with how we engage, interact, and survive in the outer world. Jung's psychology, perhaps for most, is concerned with our interiority. It is less of a focus on the outer world, but more on the journey that is happening inwards. Now, in framing or thinking about the persona as an archetype, I've come up with a few answers as to why the persona is, if you will, classified as an archetype. So one, we can be aware that we're donning a persona and having multiple personas. So in this way, the persona is not the ego, as the ego is the psychological center point of consciousness that determines which persona is to be donned in a particular situation. So this points back to this idea of decorum, of knowing which social mask we put on depending on the situation. So there's a high amount of flexibility and selectivity built into this. Now, number two, there might be an archetypal need to adapt, to live and thrive in groups. And here I'm reminded of Jung's definition of individuation, and the argument indeed that I'm making tonight is that the persona is actually highly, highly interconnected with this larger goal and process of individuation. Now, many will be familiar with this classic definition of individuation. So individuation means becoming a single homogeneous being. And insofar as individuality embraces our innermost, last, and incomparable uniqueness, it also implies becoming one's own self. We could therefore translate individuation as coming to selfhood or self-realization, end quote. Now, this is not wrong, but I think we have to balance these types of definitions of individuation with those definitions that actually emphasize the connection of the individual to society itself. So the first quotation that comes to mind is the distinction that Jung makes in CW7 between individualism and individuation. And he writes, individualism means deliberately stressing and giving prominence to some supposed peculiarity, rather than to collective considerations and obligations. But individuation means precisely the better and more complete fulfillment of the collective qualities of the human being, unquote. Okay, so we're beginning to see this, this web of interconnectedness between the individual and the groups and collectivities to which he or she belongs. So that's not all. So in CW6, in the definition section, we have this. Individuation is a process of differentiation, having for its goal the development of the individual personality. Since the individual is not only a single entity, but also, by his or her very existence, presupposes a collective relationship, the process of individuation does not lead to isolation, but to an intenser and more universal collective solidarity, end quote. Okay, so hopefully all our colleagues here will get the point that for Jung, individuation doesn't exclude the world, but brings the individual to a more integral engagement with the outer world. So it's not just about the journey inwards, right? The journey inwards of self-discovery, that indeed is a very important aspect of it. But there's also then eventually a move outward of seeing how that that new middle point, if we will, that one gains through the process of individuation, how is that then in connection with the larger world and with society in general? Now, just going back to highlight a few more points about why the persona is an archetype. There could be something instinctual there, to put masks on, to use them, to hide, to deceive, and to protect. So if I think of the natural world, I think of chameleons right away. They change color and appearance in order to camouflage. And in camouflaging, they protect themselves. And we also potentially see these instinctual urges to use masks in culture generally and the arts specifically. So I'm thinking of the use of masks in Greek tragedy and Greek theater in general, but I really want to highlight the no mask, right, which is part of no theater. Now, this is an area I'm just beginning to explore a bit more. So if colleagues here know a bit more about no theater, I'm all ears. I want to hear more. But just a few kind of tidbits that I've picked up. There are no rehearsals in no theater. So each character will know their own part, but the first time these parts come together to form a whole is actually on stage. right? So it's very interesting. There's something about formality and structure in their individual compartments, but when it comes together, there's this kind of creativity, this spontaneity as well, which I find very interesting. But more particularly and specifically, I am just absolutely intrigued by the masks that they use. So you can see from this slide here, it's one mask, but depending on how the actor or actress tilts their head, how they might shift the body position, use their voice, the expression actually changes, right? Which is absolutely fascinating. So this is what I want colleagues to hold in mind tonight as a reference point. I want to use an image of a no mask as a keyhole to exploring the many faces or facets of the persona. So in line with Jung's thinking, every archetype is bipolar in nature. There is a positive pole, there is a negative pole, and there's everything in between. And there are images, if you will, to capture everything in between. Now, the persona hasn't been paid much attention. So part of the desire to deliver this lecture on the persona is to restore some of its importance in Jung's thinking. I want us literally to shift our perspective on the persona, seeing it in another light by repositioning the shot itself and how we frame it. Now, what attention the persona does get in Jung's thinking is often negative. So he writes about the persona in his 1928 essay, Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious, where he describes the persona among other archetypes, like the shadow, the anima and animus, the man of personality, and the self. Now, after that, it all but disappears from Jung's work. Usually, Jung couches the persona in quite negative terms. In one instance, he refers to the persona as an empty role that hides one's authentic being and individual self. So that's certainly one aspect or one definition of the persona. It conceals. Rather than facilitating individuation, it hinders it. So Jung writes, the aim of individuation is nothing less than to divest the self of the false wrappings of the persona, on the one hand, and the suggestive power of primordial images on the other. Everyone knows what is meant by putting on official airs or playing a social role. Through the persona, a man or woman tries to appear as this or that, or he or she hides behind a mask, or he or she may even build up a definite persona as a barricade. So the problem of the persona should present no great intellectual difficulties. Now, through the representations of the persona in film, I really want to challenge this negative estimation. It seems that Jung himself is rather one-sided when it comes to the persona, splitting it, if I may bring in some Klein, between the good object of individuation and the self on the one hand, and the bad breast of the persona on the other. But to be fair to Jung, however, he does say that there is nothing wrong with the persona per se. We all have to don these masks in order to survive and not alienate others. The problem lies in over-identifying with the persona, of believing that who we are only amounts to the persona and nothing else. It is this over-identification with the persona that is pathological in Jung's psychology. So let's just read this quickly for our colleagues. The construction of a collectively suitable persona means a formidable concession to the external world, a genuine self-sacrifice which drives the ego straight into identification with the persona, so that people really do exist who believe they are what they pretend to be. The soullessness of such an attitude is, however, only apparent, for under no circumstances will the unconscious tolerate the shifting of the center of gravity. When we examine such cases critically, we find that the excellence of the mask is compensated by the private life going on behind it. Now, from the three films we've chosen tonight, I say we're actually spoiled for choice in terms of examples depicting this more negative aspect of the persona. And I want to start things off by this great film, Wall Street. Maybe that's a highly subjective point of view. Right, so 1987, directed by Oliver Stone. So we have many, many great examples of a pathological identification with the persona in this film, where Charlie Sheen's character, Bud Fox, begins to lose sight of his humble beginnings. He betrays his father and the airline he works for, Blue Star, by providing insider information to Gordon Gekko, to prove his worth. Now, we see this throughout the entire film in both subtle and not so subtle ways. And one thing that struck me that I just couldn't let go of, he adopts this phrase, "I'll talk at you," right? "I'll talk at you." Now, what are some of the thoughts evoked when someone says, "I'll talk at you"? There's a singularity of purpose. There's a sense that someone's not listening. There's no dialogue. There's no meaningful exchange. So everything is very one-sided. But encapsulated in this phrase, I also see the forcefulness of the persona and how overpowering and oppressive it actually can be. And here we come to our first scene, and this is a montage. So I'll just escape for now. I'll stop share, and I will share the clip and make sure I choose the right one. Okay, let's see, here we go. Right, everyone. Okay, so very interesting scene. There's a pasta maker. I think it didn't catch it in this particular clip. There was a sushi maker as well, a handheld blender. Now, at the time, this was a really big deal, right? These are all kind of the opulent gadgets that everyone had if you were truly, truly living the life. And the scene with the interiors, for me, it just kind of smacks of the persona. So there's the fake exposed brick, the gold leaf in the corner. And even with the paintings, he doesn't care how it looks. He doesn't know how to care how it looks. It's his girlfriend, played by Daryl Hannah, who's basically telling this is on trend, right? This is what this ideal apartment should look like. And it's very telling. She says to him, Home and Garden, this big magazine, they're going to come take photos of this before before we actually live in it. So there's something about this being a show home, something that perhaps is not to be really lived in, that it is more a house or a dwelling rather than encompassing, if you will, this warmth that maybe surrounds this concept of home itself. So after this perfect dinner with the perfect woman, capped off with this perfect lovemaking, he wakes up, he stands on his balcony, gazing into the night skyline, and asks himself, who am I? You then see Bud's persona begin to crack as he realizes that Gecko has played him as he plans to liquidate Blue Star. His girlfriend in the film, Darianne, won't stay with him if he crosses Gecko. And I just couldn't help myself. So we'll go back to this. Actually, let me just stop share for a second to make sure I can see colleagues here. Take that off. Right. Here. Right. I mean, Gordon Gecko. So chameleons aren't the only ones, or aren't the only animals, if you will, that can change color to camouflage, to hide, and to conceal. Now, Bud double crosses Gecko, so he goes to his rival, Sir Larry Wildman, played by Terrence Stamp, to buy shares in Blue Star so as to undercut Gecko's ownership of Blue Star. So Bud's donning the persona that Gecko helped him build, but mobilizing it purposefully to ruin his former mentor. Now, eventually, Bud decides to cooperate with the FBI and wears a wire. And again, here we see him donning a role, playing a persona to extract information that will lead to Gecko's conviction. You could also see this scene as a starting point for Bud's awakening, i.e. realizing that the persona of Gordon Gecko doesn't quite align with the demands of his archetypal self. So we will go to our next scene. There we go. Actually, we'll stop share for a sec. So, very telling words there. I'm just Bud Fox. As much as I wanted to be Gordon Gecko, I'll always be Bud Fox. So, Bud is most likely going to do some time in jail, and you could argue that he's actually hitting rock bottom here. But in doing so, one has hope that he's beginning to define himself in ways that aren't exclusively in accordance with his persona. Now, one could see this as confirming what Jung thought, i.e., that the persona is to be overcome before embarking on the path of individuation. But seen in another way, and keeping in mind the image of the no mask, could we not say that an identification with the persona could serve a potentially positive purpose, i.e., it is a necessary stage on the path towards individuation? Bud doesn't get to the point of rock bottom without first exploring the persona he's built for himself and how this image doesn't align with who he really is. But it's important to note that it's still a part of him. He utilizes aspects of it to serve his goals and to carve a new path for himself. What I take away from Wall Street and what it's telling me about the persona is that what we should be aiming to build consciously is a persona that is aligned with the values of the inner self. In this way, I don't see the persona as different from the self, but rather as intricately interconnected with it. So interconnected with the self. And this is something our colleague Robert Hopke, has argued in his book on the persona. So is the persona all negative? In donning a persona and identifying with Gecko's image, Bud is learning. He is growing. He is becoming more assertive. And we see this actually very well portrayed in The Mask. So I'm just going to go back to my slides here. Okay. Whoops. Right. Directed by Chuck Russell, 1994, The Mask, based actually on a graphic novel, which many people might not know about. But for here, or where do we begin this conversation? I think there's a real comparison between who Stanley Ipkiss is before he finds the mask and who he becomes after donning this particular persona. So at the start, he's described as, quote unquote, the nicest guy, which basically means he's a pushover. So there's this opening scene where he's interested in one of his coworkers. He wants to take her on a date, and he gets 2 concert tickets, really difficult to get, and he's inviting her to go. Now, the coworker doesn't want to go with him. She says that her best friend's in town. Could he get a 3rd ticket? And she knows it's impossible for him to get that 3rd ticket. So what does he do? He just gives the 2 tickets away and he doesn't go. So the persona that comes to the forefront when he puts on the mask is his complete opposite, i.e. that which lies in the unconscious and that which is undeveloped within himself. And here then, we'll go to our next scene. And this is the first time that Jim Carrey as the mask puts on the mask that he's found. Okay, so the oscillation between one extreme to the next often tells us that the gulf between the ideal, what we want or what we think we want to become, and the real, i.e. who we actually are, is too great. So more integration needs to occur. There needs to be a movement towards a middle position, not one torn between opposing ways of being. Now, Stanley lacks assertiveness and aggression, yet it comes out in this extreme form, which is equally unattractive, unnecessary. So a lot of the graphic violence we see throughout. And when he's relating to others, it often comes across as inauthentic and very sleazy. Now, having said that, there are also some positives that could be taken away. So in his everyday life, while he's in this process of donning this mask, he's changing. He's not that punctual anymore going to work. He's not as tidy. He speaks back to his boss. So the persona of Stanley Ipkiss is cracking, and the persona of the mask is starting to assert its right to psychic space. Now, this tension comes to a crescendo when Stanley goes to visit Dr. Newman, the doctor who's written this book on the persona or the mask. So we've got another scene to share here. Okay, so very interesting, the connection here between Loki as the trickster and the persona as well. And many colleagues here will be familiar with Jung's definition of the trickster. That imperative, which presents itself as doing harm, but ultimately can actually do some good. And here we're reminded of Faust Part 1 and the role of Mephistopheles, which Jung wrote about extensively, and he drew a lot from Goethe. Now, by the end of the film, Stanley is more confident. He's not over-identified with the mask, but he's taken something away, arguably something positive, from that experience of oscillating to a diametrically opposed persona. So, Jung is right. Don't identify with the persona, but equally, I would say, don't knock it. Stated another way, we don't survive without a persona. We might as well build an authentic persona that doesn't violate who we truly are, and through which we can journey towards individuation, which entails both an engagement with inner reality and our outer world. So the persona is one of the vessels that carries us towards individuation. And here I'm reminded of some of the quotes I presented earlier about the need to balance a more individualistic understanding of understanding and positioning it with more collective understandings and relational aspects of individuation. Now, for the third film that we're going to, and I'll just bring up my slides here. So we're going to a 2019 film called The Farewell. Very interesting film. Now, I see this film as a clash of personas, a clash between, let's say, individual personas, but also a clash with this process of renegotiating a cultural identity or a cultural persona. It also allows us to appreciate the extent to which our personas are shaped by our cultural, socio-political circumstances. Now, Billy, in the middle here, played by Awkwafina, is Chinese, and she lives in New York. And she's still very close to her grandmother. So in this opening scene, they're calling each other on, she's on her mobile, her grandma's on a phone back in China. And her grandmother is this kind of very doting, worrying type. And she's asking Billy, are you wearing a coat? Are you warm enough? Who's that you speaking to? Are you speaking to a stranger on the street? And she's telling her, no, I'm not. Are you wearing any jewelry that might get stolen, et cetera, et cetera? So throughout this whole process, she's basically doing these things and she's lying to her grandmother. Equally, the grandmother is lying to her. So Billy actually hears the hospital PA go off in the background, and it kind of tweaks her. And she's like, well, where are you, grandma? And her grandma then makes an excuse and hangs up and doesn't tell her she's actually at the hospital. Now, the film is based on a dilemma. What do you do when a loved one is diagnosed with a terminal illness and they don't actually know about it? Do you tell them or do you lie? From Billy's perspective, as an individual growing up in a Western society, you have to tell them, right? There might be practical things that they have to take care of. They need to get their affairs in order. They might want to say goodbye to certain people because they know their time is limited. But from the family's point of view, you shouldn't. So you shouldn't be telling them. Why burden them in their last days? Why make them even more nervous and anxious in the face of death? It's better to tell a good lie to make the last days as enjoyable and as stress-free as possible. Let the family carry the burden of the emotions. Now, what's intriguing is the extent to which the family goes to preserve this lie or this collective persona of Chinese culture. So the grandson's courtship with his Japanese girlfriend is basically fast-tracked so that a wedding banquet can be held. And this will be the occasion that brings the family together so that they can spend time with grandma and say goodbye to her. Now, Billy's family initially didn't want her to go because she didn't have that mask. She couldn't hide her emotions. They knew that when she saw her grandmother, she would break down and she would basically let slip that the grandma's diagnosis was terminal. Now, throughout the movie, there are several scenes where the various positions of this debate are laid out. And I've got one scene here to share with colleagues. Right. So this scene is also very telling and reveals another facet of Chinese culture, i.e. the potential shame that the granddaughter is not engaged, she hasn't settled yet, and she's not getting any younger. The family needs to proverbially save face. And we'll just, we'll just go back to our slides here. Right. So this is a quote from Angie Chung's book, Saving Face. So for example, the Asian practice of saving face or maintaining one's dignity and reputation by hiding and avoiding humiliating or embarrassing situations involves not only molding one's behavior in front of others, but also reining in feelings of anger, shame, and disappointment that they fear may undermine their self-integrity. So when they're at the restaurant that's going to hold this banquet, the grandmother is arguing with the staff there, saying, you know what, I bought lobster rather than crab because lobster tastes better, it's more expensive. They're putting drinks on the table for free for guests. And everyone really would just be happy with some beer, but grandma's saying, no, we want to put champagne out because it costs more money. And then they have this really detailed conversation at the dinner table as to determine how many years the grandson and his betrothed have known each other before they've got married, because it was a very short period of time. So there's this constant need, if you will, to save face, to not be embarrassed, to upkeep the family name. But interestingly, the movie is also steeped in the process of challenging convention. The fact that the granddaughter is the favorite and not the grandson is absolutely revolutionary. It is showing us that what lies on the surface and what actually the reality is, they're sometimes, usually, well, more often than not aligned. The reality in all its complexity is that the personas constantly being negotiated. Now, what I'm calling the cultural persona cannot be completely split off from the individual one. They are interconnected and both inform a persona more aligned with the archetypal self. And here I want to go to another scene depicting this conflict. And what you see here is the emergence of a new persona, one that is neither completely Western or Eastern. And we'll just find that clip here. So in this scene, the virtue of saving face actually breaks down, and it's the catalyst for some emotional bond, some connection to be forged between the mother and daughter. And it's basically the daughter trying to show her mother and her family another way of being. So this persona, this need to save face, is temporarily suspended to allow this connection and to allow for this relationship. Now, it's not completely gone, but the scene depicts a moment where this vulnerability is allowed to come to the forefront, and again, to foster connection and relationship. Now, a turning point comes when Billy herself decides to don the more Chinese persona by actually going to the hospital to intercept her grandmother's test results so that she doesn't find out what's actually happening. So this is the last scene I will share, and then I'll have some brief concluding remarks. Right. So here she's definitely showing a certain one-sidedness. She's definitely identifying with what you might call the more Chinese persona, but I would put this in the larger perspective. This is one movement in a larger dynamic process. And this completely aligns with the nature of her shifting identity and the issues that she's dealing with right now. The tension of being Chinese and American, of being betwixt and between. So being in this moment of liminality and of transition. So long as there isn't a complete identification, this temporary one-sidedness can be fruitful. Realizing the existence of competing personas and temporarily identifying with them can help people get out of their comfort zones. And these can help one adapt. It can show one an aspect of oneself that perhaps would lie dormant and undeveloped if one didn't take that leap. But notably, one can be strengthened and emboldened by the mask we consciously put on. So here I'm thinking again back to the mask. When we put on these masks, we are potentially daring to be something different. We are potentially daring to be something more. And that's the end of the lecture.
Amazing, Kevin. Thank you so much for that presentation. It was really, really interesting. There were definitely things in Wall Street that I didn't catch. For example, the house, how in the Flickering Reality book that my granddad wrote, F. David Pete, he talks about the film Being There, which is a film about this. I'll just keep it very short. It's basically this guy who has no persona. He's never really even left the house. He's just a gardener of this rich man's house. And the garden is just incredibly beautiful, and that apparently is supposed to represent sort of the subconscious. But once you see the outside of the house, you see it's a very small, not much decoration. It's just a very basic front of the house, which is supposed to show he has no face. He has no persona. So it was very interesting about that Wall Street. And of course, the farewell, the cultural personas that you show is also very important. I never really put together the culture and the persona together. So thank you so much for bringing all of these aspects to light.
Yeah, and thank you, James. I mean, in preparation, I did read that bit on the persona and the interpretation, and I actually want to see the film because, from what I understand, through this comedy of errors, he kind of ends up doing all these big things, and people misinterpret his kind of, I wouldn't even call it mistakes, but just his way of bumbling through as these kind of great acts of intelligence, et cetera, et cetera. So very, very interesting.
Yeah, it's a great film. It's very funny as well. So I do recommend it to everyone. Well, I guess we can move on to discussion and Q&A now. As I said before, if you want to ask a question, you can either use the raise your hand function at the bottom of your screen under reactions, or physically raise your hand, or if you feel shy, you can write it in the chat box. So who has a question first? Eddie.
Thanks very much. Yeah, that was very interesting, Kevin. Yeah, very interesting, actually. What I was thinking about, Jung obviously had ideas, I presume, due to the era he lived through, about the absence of individuation and the presence of totalitarianism. And I just wondered what he might have been saying about that. I mean, it was interesting also to watch the movie there, the last one on China, because at the moment, China has become really descended, it seems, into totalitarianism. And I was reading that one of the very subtle ways they control the masses is they put the emphasis on each individual to be only as much as possible primarily concerned about themselves. So it's a very fragmented individualism. So I just wonder what maybe Jung may have said about the connection between the lack of individuation in the true sense and the presence of totalitarianism.
Good question, Eddie. In the context of the persona, I'm just trying to think. Obviously, the text that comes to mind is The Undiscovered Self, where basically Jung is against any kind of ism because it leads, to this group mentality. And in general for Jung, you're much like Freud, he follows Le Bon on group psychology, that the mass is nasty, it's unthinking, and ultimately you need individual consciousness to stand in the center, if you will, and to kind of resist this mass-mindedness. But, people didn't always buy what Le Bon was saying, even in his own context. And I think for me at least, what social media has really shown is that collectives aren't necessarily all bad. So if you think about, people who are fighting for a particular cause, one note on Facebook that says 12 p.m., on Wednesday. And all of a sudden you have all these people show up. And to me, that shows this kind of beauty in the collectivity as well, that, based on one galvanizing issue, people are coming together, being together in relationship to fight this one cause. So I don't think Jung always gets it right in terms of the group. Now, how it relates to totalitarianism specifically, I mean, I find Jung's understanding of what happened in Germany quite problematic, because in Wotan, which is part of Essays on Contemporary Events, he basically says that, there were socio-political reasons for what happened, there are economic ones, et cetera, but they just don't suffice. So in one fell swoop, he kind of recognizes them, and then he says, no, actually, because the one thing that can help us come to grips with the sheer irrationality of what happened is this idea of a constellation of an archetype. And I think there's something in it, but it needs to sit alongside, I think, that analysis where you look to the socioeconomic aspects, the political ones, et cetera, to form a more kind of holistic view of what's actually going on. So I don't know, that's probably not a direct answer to your question, Eddie, but if anything else comes up in the context of speaking to other people, I'll definitely try to come back to it. But you may respond as well.
Just to quickly say,
Yeah.
I mean, I agree, you see, what you just said, because there's a big difference between a group mind and a collective intelligence. So a collective intelligence is a very powerful thing for the good. Whereas a group mind, there is no individuality in group mind. So I just was thinking of what's going on in China and also what had gone on in Nazi Germany, as Jung had lived through that era. But no, that's very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Eddie.
Yeah. We'll take the next question from Valjean.
Yeah. Hi, thanks, James. This is possibly more in the nature of a comment, but I was just thinking back to the times of my life when I was wearing persona masks. And now I'm wondering, how much does the projection of others who see us enter into this and keep feeding us into this persona mask? And not always a negative one, but nonetheless, I was just thinking of the power of the projection of others.
Yes.
No, that's a really great point. Yeah, so in many ways, I think as that third film shows, we're kind of shaped by our cultural context as well. And there are certain pressures that are exerted from those domains. Yeah, no, absolutely agree.
Thank you for that point. Very interesting. Anyone else have a question? Oh, Chris. Oh, you're just muted.
Right, I should know better, shouldn't I? Okay. If no one else is asking this, it strikes me, it was very interesting what you were saying at the very beginning, Kevin. I think it was point B about persona being, why is it an archetype? Because it's an instinctual thing. And then it strikes me, given the other two questions just now, that the persona is halfway between individuation and mass-mindedness, because it is a sort of mass-minded, agreed way of being part of a group. And yet, on the other hand, it and so it's one of the traps that we can fall into for Jung, to actually diminish and not extend our humanity and be in touch with our full potential. But on the other hand, he's saying it's there and it's essential and it's part of what it is to be a human being, just as like having an ego is necessary. That's one thing. And then the second thing is that, do you reckon that's less so these days, in that we are in a sort of culture where persona has really changed? So it's A, not so identifiable, or B, it's itself, persona doesn't seem to be such a rigid thing anymore, or are we fooling ourselves that it is like that? There's a lot of points. Sorry.
Really interesting, Chris. Really interesting. I mean, it's kind of totally spurred my thinking in different ways. Wow. I mean, the persona, I think, has become more and more important. So if we look at, you know, social media, and I know Facebook is being taken over by things, you know, well, TikTok, things I don't even know about. So, you know, Facebook is kind of for people of our generation, that social media for our generation. But, you know, the pictures we put up of ourselves, you know, we're not going to put pictures up of ourselves where, you know, we had a great party last night, we've woken up and, you know, we're all bleary-eyed. No, usually the picture we put on that page, or on that landing page, is us the way we want to present ourselves, all dolled up, you know, presented very well, et cetera, et cetera. So there's something about maybe the culture itself being a persona culture.
Then it's a more, yes, but then it's a more trivial persona, isn't it? I mean, the persona used to be, I am a lawyer, I am a doctor, I am the teacher, and now it's just this moment, that moment, isn't it?
Yeah, but you see, there's also this trend where you have these youngsters these days. Yeah, I'm feeling a bit older now, where they have this saying, keep it real. And there's something still about this kind of intuition of saying there's something real beyond what all this is. Now, the other question that is, you know, off kind of a slight tangent, Chris, is that all these ideas in Jung, I think they need to be rethought and readapted to the context we find ourselves in. So individuation back in Jung's time might have meant that, you know what, this city's a bit hectic, let's go to the country, you know, let's just kind of relax there. But the context has changed. We're literally constantly switched on. I have this phone, right? And I could switch it off, but equally these pings constantly persecute me. So even though I'm in the country and trying not to be connected, in many ways, if I don't have that willpower to completely turn it off, I'm still connected. So what does individuation look like now in this hyper connected world? So what does individuation actually now look like in this neoliberal storm that we find ourselves in? Because what individuation meant back then, we can't use those same examples now. So that's, I think, a part of that larger question, Chris. What does it all mean now, right? And is it still possible in our milieu and in our context?
But what about the thing that it's an archetype? Now, are you using archetype like this is just a general, typical human way of doing things? Or is it an archetype because actually it's how the world, matter and psyche is? And how come persona can be part of that thing?
But then that goes into this larger discussion of how we define an archetype. So, you know, we could have, you know, this conversation about I mean, do you remember Pietikainen in 1996? He puts in the JAP and he wants to basically say, let's move away from Jean Knox and what she's doing. And who's the guy who wrote Archetype? Anthony Stevens. And move away from the biology. Let's move more to the socially constructed. And you see, if you remember, everyone descended on him, Pietikainen, like he was the plague. But now you see people in the JAP like Warren Coleman, who are basically arguing that it's less about this kind of preformed pattern and more about the patterns of culture itself, right? So we don't have to hold on to necessarily this idea of something that's ingrained and passed down, but patterns arise through the process of culture and interaction. And in that case, the persona kind of fits there, doesn't it?
It is. And then it goes, I'll finish here. Let someone else have a chance. It goes back to, you know, it is a typical human attribute. And in as much it helps us understand what it is to be a human being, leading to, well, what should we do and be as human beings? So know this one, know ego, know this, know that, and know ourselves. That's what I'd say.
Lovely, Chris.
Yeah, cool.
Thank you, Chris. Very interesting. And there's so much to build on that as well, especially in the context of social media, how really what we're doing is just showing a persona. But of course, we don't only have Facebook. We've got Twitter, we've got Instagram, we've got LinkedIn, all different showing on each account, showing a different side to ourselves, whether it's, professional or trying to look cool or whatever. And of course, it's all inside the phone. So inside of the phone, you have a collection of your personas that you can pick and choose depending on what you want to use it for. So it's all very interesting, and maybe we can come back to it later and build more. But for now, we'll just take the question from Lena.
Well, yeah, it was just an observation on what Chris has started with. We like this thing with persona. I really think it's part of, our evolution as a human being and also as a society. But we have to understand that biologically, like human beings are the species where the infant is the most for the longest period of time, depending on the parent. And so this persona is more or less a mechanism of survival. Like you have to make your parents happy, otherwise your survival is in jeopardy. And that's a reality. That's a biological reality. And I think that we are shifting. I know there's social medias and stuff, and we're all like, going crazy with this. But I think that more and more we see it's out there that people struggle. Before it used to be always hidden. Now it's a reality that people are showing up more and more. We are more and more conscious of this impact that it has on our life and how we choose to be. I mean, for me, with the work that I do, it's really becoming adults, like getting to be aware of the persona because we are in survival, because we didn't know we were in survival. We were just, trying to survive in this thing, and then becoming aware and then saying that it's working against us, because our true place in society, I believe, in life is, I call it inhabiting ourselves, our true selves. But we're only discovering this through this persona, let's say, because we are confronted with certain situations, because we have experiences, and then we realize, God, I call it being next to my basket, my shoes, and then you realize that you have to choose something, and it's a process. To me, this ego thing, which is so negatively carried out, I think it's too bad, because I think it is part of growing up, of becoming an adult, and as I said, I am happy to see that more and more people will be willing to show their vulnerability or the places where they have crashed and they have, risen again. And I think it's I think we are in this era, to me, much more than we're, wanting to show up. Yeah, a lot of people want to show off only their good side, but it's never been seen before. This honesty about the struggles that we go through and this and that, and seeing so many people wanting to help each other in a way to overcome these things and become truer and truer to ourselves. Just what I wanted to share.
Yeah.
No, that's fantastic, Lena. Great reflection. And again, there might be something about the context itself that's brought this up, because I could say, or I think in every era, people will feel that the world is ending to a certain extent, that there's always, I mean, now it's kind of social media and phones that are bringing our downfall. But before that, it was the typewriter. And even before that, it was the telephone.
There's always been something.
Yeah.
Every generation always says about the next generation that they're going down. Every generation, it's always been that way.
Yeah.
And for me, the pandemic, to me, is very representative of what we are unable but called to do, is this when you think about it, we're physically stuck inside our home, when technically what it represents is having to go into our home, to identify who we are, because we are we're unable to do it consciously, we do it physically. But this is where we're going. Look at all the people that going through this period, which is actually, to me, an ending, like a death of a certain way of being, into the emergence of this new, Aquarius era that I believe that we're becoming. And people are more, and they're not going to be individualistic. They're going to be more of who they are, to be part of life, to have their right place in life, into this, in our community, will be more, I think that that's the best way to express your existence, you know, through where you truly are. And I think that this pandemic thing, being stuck in and having to live with yourself, and this, yes, there are social medias, I understand, but I know more and more people that are not taking part into, you know, the medias. I myself, for one thing, I don't care, you know, but I do other stuff. So anyway, I'm just, I'll just let other people talk, but this is what I truly believe in it. It's been very, very interesting what you've brought up, and I'm very grateful for it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Lena.
Thank you. Next question from Joy.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Kevin. This was really great. And I really liked that you brought in the different cultural perspective as well. Yeah, this kind of gave me a little bit of an aha moment. It's sort of funny. I look at persona, like when I put on a work persona, you know, it's just a necessary thing, or that's how I interpret it. Maybe it isn't necessary, but I don't I don't really identify it with it that much. And I thought it was very interesting when you were saying that, you know, this is like a shadow figure or something. I don't know if you actually said that, but that was kind of how a takeaway I took, was that it's, you know, it is another aspect of ourselves that we maybe don't always, or else we become over-identified with it, where we walk through the door at the end of the day, we still, you know, are that professor or doctor or whatever, ditch digger, whatever it is we are. So I just think it was interesting. It just gave me some food for thought. And so I want to thank you for that. I wanted to, one other thing too, someone, maybe it was Chris, said something about how the people are picking up different personas more frequently than it seems like in the past. And so I think that is a very interesting thought as well, because I just think about how it feels like our species has sped up so much that now, you know, we can't have, even speaking of myself, I mean, I don't know how many different professional identities I've had. It's quite a few. And so it's like, so it's in a way we're exploring these different aspects that are of ourselves at a much faster pace. And so that was an interesting thought. Anyway, thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, Joy. And I mean, while you were speaking, the book that actually came to mind, edited by Murray Stein, I believe it was called Psyche at Work. I'm looking at Chris as my senior and hoping to God he knows the actual title. But I think it was called Psyche at Work. And I think, you know, the premise of the book itself is that people individuate at work. It's, you know, yes, it's important to kind of split off, especially I think, you know, if the experience isn't ideal, but equally how we go through, I mean, our relationships with colleagues, how we progress through a system, promotion, etc. It's all part of that process. So it can be a container, if you will, for that individual journey and development as well.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. Kevin, are you happy to take one more question? Yeah,
I think there's Alan and then Rocky Stone also that got the hands up. Okay. So I'm happy to take those last two.
Okay, great. Well, we'll start with Rocky, if that's okay. Oh, you're muted at the moment.
Kevin, I wanted to say thank you. I mean, just a wonderful presentation, but sort of the most extreme example of persona was the real estate lady. Thank you so much for that example.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Are you? Yeah. Okay, thank you, Rocky, for that. And yeah, we'll take the last question from Alan.
Evan, thank you. I found your presentation incredibly thought-provoking, and I'm actually quite shocked. So I really need probably another sort of couple of hours to reflect on what you said to even ask you a question. But I guess what I'm really struck by is clearly personas are necessary. They have a role to play.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel that there's sort of two different situations, one in which the persona is completely phony, but another where you can adopt a persona and still, believing in it, actually say what you think and do what you say.
Mm-hmm.
And I think my question is, given everything you've discovered, what advice would you give in terms of, well, adopting personas? When and how, and any advice in terms of not, well, essentially not becoming totally phony?
Wow. Thank you so much, Alan. Okay, so the immediate thing that comes to mind is that as much as I don't like that phoniness, perhaps in my own kind of time of life, that phoniness can save you sometimes in terms of your workplace. So, I can think of certain situations in my context where the true side of me wants to make a perspective known and to say it in a very particular way. But the thing that holds me back is the persona, to know that in this context, I can't do it. Now, moving more towards an authentic persona, I'll give you an example, actually. So when I got, into analytical psychology, I was originally a history specialist, and I moved out of history and found my way to the academic study of Jung through the psychology of religion, odd enough. And, as I was doing my training, doing my PhD, etc., I thought about issues of race and racism, but I constantly said to myself, you know what? I don't want to be that guy who talks about race and racism. So the guy who's actually identifying himself as a minority, I don't want to be the guy in the field that talks about minority topics. And for a long while, I struggled with it. And it comes across in my publications. I was talking about history. I was talking about a cultural complex and kind of moving and critiquing that. And it came to the point, once my own children were born, and some of the things that kind of happened to us and the racism we experienced, something just snapped, Alan, and said, you know what? You can't avoid talking about this because you are positioned to talk about it. And to do anything else is a lie to yourself. And for ages, I would say, you know what? I'm not a political person. I could care less what's happening in the world. But more and more, I found that my own identity was just tied up in our context. And that had to move me in that direction. It's like, you know what? I've been avoiding it for so long. It's time to just tackle it. And when I began to get into this topic a bit more, and I'm still learning, things flowed quite naturally. So I guess the response there, Alan, is that there are things that perhaps we intrinsically or intuitively know that these are the lines that we should go down. But for one reason or another, we stop ourselves from doing it. And it's really at that crucial point to stop and really question and ask, well, what's going on here? And who knows, we may decide to kind of take that leap. So that's the persona I'm kind of working on now, the guy in analytical psychology who talks about race and racism.
Well, and can I endorse that? As Kevin's senior, as he keeps calling me, us Jungians, including Kevin, have gone through years of setting this aside and not bringing together the idea of persona and this particular angle we got in the last third of Kevin's presentation. And it's very important, and it's a very modern way of considering Jung's ideas. So they're not just part of him and his time, but they are very relevant to what we are now.
Okay, can I just ask,
Thank
Kevin,
you.
am I right in thinking that that's what you mean by individuation? Because what I took from that was discovering the part you should play, as you just described, and then playing it.
Yeah, and the persona is a part of that image. So, I see these images of self kind of rather grandiose, but with a persona, I mean, for me personally, it's a bit down to earth. I can grapple with it. I can play with it. I can mold it consciously. And I think that's a big part of Jung's psychology as well, that, that gets left by the wayside. Yes, there's an overemphasis on the unconscious because in his context, there needed to be an overemphasis on the importance of the unconscious. But ultimately for Jung, consciousness does the work. The ego does the work. right? So if we have something that lies in the unconscious, in potential, it only becomes a reality through our ego consciousness, through that will. So I think the persona, as Chris was saying, is this kind of midway point. I never thought of it that way before, between mass-mindedness and individuation. But I think that's actually a really nice thought and image to go away with.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alan.
Could I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
I got in late. I'm sorry. I missed this, and I'm very interested, but I got hung up in my computer and so forth. I see this is being recorded though. How can we access that recording so I could hear what the earlier part of this was?
Yeah, so that it will be available on our YouTube channel next week.
Ah, okay.
Okay.
One comment about this, even though I don't know what your topic was. To me, persona is like a language. You choose, and they can all be authentic, but you choose a language based upon who you're having a conversation with, who you're interacting with. And so it's like you don't bring in extraneous stuff to what it is you're trying to have a conversation about. That's what it means to me. But you can have, all of them can be authentic to me. Anyway.
Thank you, Charles.
Yes.
And I'll look for it because it's.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you.
Yeah, so it's, I guess we are running over, so I guess we should start closing this session. Kevin, do you have any last remarks you want to give us before we leave?
Yeah, what a great community. I'm so pleased that I've been brought in and stumbled across this community. Really fantastic questions, really enlivening and pushing me to think further as well. So thank you again all for having me, and I hope there will be opportunities in the future to join you again.
Thank you so much, Kevin. It was great to have you, and I really hope you get more involved with our community. Thank you so much, Chris, for getting us in touch. Yeah, again, thank you again, Kevin, for your presentation. Thank you for everyone who has contributed to the discussion. Thank you to those who contributed to the discussion in the chat. I've been following, very interesting things have come up there. And yes, finally, everyone, thank you everyone who joined us. Before we go, I'd just like to invite you to a few Party Center events that we'll be running over the next few months. So first of all, I'd just like to invite you to a very special event that we'll be running over 3 months, 3 sessions a month, entitled Epistemic Justice, curated and presented by Dr. Baba Buntu. This program starts on the 12th of May and will be rooted in African worldviews and explore aspects of history that have had a devastating impact in human development. Rather than providing answers and solutions to these problems, this series will attempt to seek a common thinking and encourage a multidisciplinary approach to transformation. This event will tackle 12 key concepts in 3 different categories. The categories are the physical, the cognitive, and the social sphere, and the metaphysical. And each session will be looking at one aspect of those. So I hope you'll join us for that. I'd also like to invite you for one of our main events this summer entitled What is Consciousness? And this event will run on the 5th to the 27th of June on weekends, where we will explore consciousness, not only from a neurophysical perspective, but also from a psychological, philosophical, and human perspective. For this event, we're honored to have this incredible lineup with Richard Baker Roshi, Valerie Hardcastle, Basil Hiley, Bernardo Kastrup, Gary Lackman, Ian McGilchrist, Roger Kmain, Paolo Pilkanen, Beverly Zabriskie, all chaired and curated by our director here at the Party Center, Shantina Sabadini. And finally, I'd just like to invite you all to support the Party Center by becoming a friend of the Party Center, which is our membership program. By becoming a friend, you'll have access to the Friends of the Party Center Sutra Circle, which is sort of our online forum. You will receive 10% discount on all of our events, online and live. And you'll also receive a free membership to the Party Perspectives, a quarterly journal which includes a compilation of essays revolving around a specific theme. The next issue will have the theme of duality. So it's going to be really exciting issue. So I hope you will get the membership. But if you want more information about becoming a member, visit our website. It will be in, there's a big button for it. So you will definitely see it. As always, you can contact us through our website where we've got a contact us section, or you can visit our Facebook page or YouTube channel, or you can just directly send an email to us directly. You can email James at partycenter.com to contact me, or Eleanor at partycenter.com to contact Eleanor, our program director. Thank you again, everyone, and we'll see you again soon here at the Party Center. Bye-bye.